Hi, everyone. We are just going to give a couple of minutes for folks to join before we get started. Folks are still trickling in, so we'll give it another minute or two here before we get going. We'll give it till 3 minutes after to get started. Thank you, everyone who's joined so far. Really appreciate it. All right, so it's 3 minutes after the hour, so thank you so much for coming to Counterspark's first webinar. First of all, if you signed up for this prior to yesterday, it said that J.R. Tolbert, the president of Counterspark, was going to be here. He unfortunately could not make it today. So hello, I'm Amanda Foster. I'm the digital director at Counterspark, and I'm so excited to be here. And I'm so happy that several of you have joined our webinar today. We are very excited to start a series of webinars to teach people more about energy and, just chat with experts in the field. So first of all, this webinar is on transmission, and whether you just thought transmission was a car part until you got a Counterspark email, or whether you are a transmission expert who's been in the field for decades, we hope there will be some kind of a takeaway here for you. It's so crucial to learn about our energy system. So, hopefully you can also teach your friends and family about it. Transmission is at the top of mind for a lot of people right now. It's extreme heat in a lot of the country, including where I am. So if you are in an extreme heat area, please stay safe. But we're just hoping there are no blackouts or anything like that. Energy transmission is crucial to keeping the lights on and keeping the AC on and all of that. So we are here today with an incredible expert, Caitlin Marquis. We are here to hear from her about transmission and the transmission rule that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission put out last month. If you are an energy newbie, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, is the government agency that has, the say over energy. And so they put out this very important rule last year. And so we are so lucky to have Caitlin. Caitlin is a managing director at Advanced Energy United. United, and she is an expert on wholesale energy markets. If you're unfamiliar with Advanced Energy United, that's an industry association that works to accelerate the transition to 100% clean energy in the US. And I know that she and her team, when FERC put the rule out, they were just slammed beforehand trying to anticipate what was going to be in it. And they were very busy after, still kind of, I think, going through that dense regulatory language that government agencies so very much like to do. Yeah, so United and Counterspark work together very closely, and I can definitely attest that she is one of the best people in the country to talk through transmission and FERC's new transmission rule. So because she's the expert, most of this is going to be me asking her questions and her answering them. I also request for you all, if you have questions on transmission, feel free to go ahead and put them in the Q&A area. We will try to get through all of the questions. I can't promise that, of course, but we will do our absolute best. But before we kick it off with the first few questions, I want to show us a little video from Transmission Possible. So we're going to go ahead and play that.
Want to speed up America's transition to clean energy? Us too. There's just one problem. It's like this. Imagine you had a brand new car, like a really nice one. Only thing is, it's stuck on an island with nowhere to go. Clever, right? That's clean energy today. We've got amazing new technology, but too much of the power we produce is stuck. It can't get to where it needs to go. America has enough clean energy in the development pipeline to get 80% of our electricity from clean sources. But our electric grid isn't yet built to transport all that energy to the people and businesses who need it. Transmission lines are the wires that move electricity from where it's created to where we use it. They're like the roads and bridges for our energy. But the lines we have today are too old, too small, or just not connected to the places where we need them to go. But if we work together to build a modern transmission grid, we can unleash that American-made energy. We can meet our climate goals, rein in unpredictable energy bills, put a stop to summer and winter blackouts, and power up America's clean economy. Plus, building and upgrading those energy roads and bridges would create up to 650,000 good-paying jobs, especially in rural areas where wind and solar power are abundant. And it would provide $2.3 billion in energy cost savings for working families. A more reliable grid, new jobs, cleaner power. Transmission makes it possible. Learn more at transmissionpossible.org.
Awesome. I really like that video. I think it's a nice little explainer. So we'll put in the chat too, but transmissionpossible.org is great. It's a project of Advanced Energy United and a coalition of partners, including Counterspark, and they are working to educate folks and build support across the country for enhanced and expanded transmission capacity. So if you have friends or family who want to know what transmission is, we'll send you this webinar in a few days, but you can send them to transmissionpossible.org as well. So with that, we will go ahead and get started by asking our ResNet expert, Caitlin, some transmission questions. So Caitlin, first of all, thank you so much for joining us. And second of all, in very simple terms, what is transmission and why is it important?
Yeah, great question. I think Yo did a good job of explaining some of that, but I'll put it in my own words also. And thank you, first of all, Amanda and Counterspark, for convening this conversation. I think transmission is one of those topics that's very important, but sort of not very widely understood necessarily. So transmission is the big poles and wires that bring electricity from where it's generated, whether that's a power plant, a wind farm, a solar farm, to where it's used, our cities and towns. These are the high voltage lines, kind of like the interstate highway system for electricity. It's what we're not talking about in this conversation is the distribution system, which is the smaller poles and wires that distribute electricity to homes and businesses. So they're sort of they're very interconnected systems, but they're they're different. We're talking about kind of that interstate highway system, the big poles and wires that carry electricity over long distances. And it's important, again, the video did a great job of describing this, but it's important to keep the lights on. A stronger web of transmission enables us to share resources across the grid to better withstand whether it's a power plant outage or a storm or a heat wave, to better keep the lights on during challenging events and during normal operations. It's also important for affordability of electricity. Transmission itself does cost money, but it can also save money because it enables us to access more affordable sources of electricity. And it's also important for the clean energy transition to enable us to access the new clean resources that are increasingly available, increasingly affordable, but located, across the country, not necessarily next to, located conveniently right next to big cities and load centers. Oh, Amanda, I think you're on mute.
It's been 4 years since lockdown, and I still sometimes forget. Okay, we hear a lot about needing new transmission in this country. Why is that?
I think there's a few reasons why we're hearing a lot about transmission currently and really over the last couple years, but it's been mounting. One of them is just simply, like a lot of our other types of infrastructure in this country, we have been underinvesting in our transmission system. So more than 70% of the grid was built over 25 years ago. A lot of our transmission infrastructure was built in the 60s and 70s. So there's just a need to invest in this infrastructure. There's also growing demand for electricity as we have manufacturing growth, electrification. There's a shifting resource mix. So we need the transmission system to be built for the resources that are coming online, the resources that are available today. And that means that we need an updated transmission grid. And then there's also increasing reliability challenges from extreme weather events. And I think an increased value on reliable electricity to power our economy that really necessitates the strongest transmission and electric grid that we can build. And so a grid that's sort of bigger than the weather as weather is becoming more challenging and more extreme, and that is equipped to address future needs from growing demand to a shifting resource mix. So I think and because of all of those drivers, you have a lot of policymakers recognizing that the way that we've been approaching transmission planning, transmission build out is falling short and is not delivering the reliable, affordable electric grid that we need to power today's needs and future needs.
Awesome. Yeah, that's so interesting. Yeah, I mean, I am thinking about like just my own friends and how many have gotten like electric cars or solar panels recently and how that'll need to be connected. So that is very interesting. And then when you hear presidents, regardless of party, talk about infrastructure, they talk about roads and bridges. They don't talk about these power lines that were built in the 1960s, which is so long ago. Yeah, I live in a condo that was built in the 80s and it's already got a lot of issues. So that's so interesting. Cool. Are there any ways that we can make our existing transmission system more efficient?
Definitely. So when we talk about the need for new transmission, it is important to also consider opportunities to make our existing transmission system work better for us. And there's been a lot of innovation in transmission. We call them grid enhancing technologies or sometimes alternative transmission technologies. But basically, there's a whole suite of both hardware, software solutions and operational solutions that can allow us to use our existing transmission system more efficiently or make upgrades to existing wires to allow them to carry more electricity. So sort of squeezing more out of the existing system. And this is really important because for a couple of reasons. We need more. Transmission takes a long time to build and is very expensive. And so if we can get more out of our existing system using existing rights of way, we're really shrinking both the time frame and the cost to get some of the benefits of increased transmission. And these are technologies. The technologies include things like dynamic line ratings, and I won't get too technical here, but things like dynamic line ratings that allow us to use our existing infrastructure and adjust what we're pushing across the transmission lines to take into account local conditions, weather conditions, line sag, so that you are using the existing transmission system more intelligently. Another technology is advanced conductors. So we've had the same basic technology in those wires that you see for many decades, but actually there are new materials that can conduct electricity more efficiently and can push more electricity through existing wires. So there's a whole suite of technologies that are available that often don't get considered because either there are incentives to instead build new or to make bigger investments, or there's just not familiarity and comfort with some of these new technologies, but they are being used. They're proven. And one thing that this recent FERC order the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission order that came out last month that you mentioned, Amanda, one thing that it does require is in the planning process to consider some of these technologies and evaluate whether they can more effectively and affordably address identified transmission needs. So hopefully going forward, we will start to see more of these kind of no-brainer, no regrets technologies being deployed more across the country, because they really, there's sort of no good reason not to use these technologies. They bring so many benefits to customers and to the grid.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah. And through Counterspark, I imagine that most people on this webinar are already on the Counterspark email list. If not, we do work with folks when there are state bills about grid enhancing technologies so that we can let you know about them, let you know when it's time to contact your legislator and stuff like that. Yeah, when I first started learning about this, I was so surprised that like how taut the wire is, like whether it's saggy or whatever can make such a big difference. Also, there are some great questions coming into the chat. If you have not yet put one in there, feel free, but we will definitely get to those. So Caitlin, how does transmission get built? Like who decides if the projects get built and who pays for it?
That is a loaded set of questions that I will try to tackle clearly and sort of in order. So there's a lot of different, and this is part of what's so interesting and also so challenging about transmission, is that there are so many actors involved in planning, evaluating, building transmission. So some of the entities involved in kind of the getting transmission built include utilities that own a lot of the lines. In some instances, they have a right to build and earn a return on new transmission investments. So utilities, own and operate transmission infrastructure. Regional planning entities in 2/3 of the country. This is an independent entity called a regional transmission organization or an independent system operator. They hold a lot of different functions, but one of those is transmission planning for a broader region. And outside of the regions that have an RTO or an ISO, there are other transmission planning entities that hold that role. There's the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission that we've mentioned a couple of times that, among other responsibilities, regulates interstate transmission of electricity. There's also local, state, and federal entities that are involved in siting and permitting reviews. So in addition to kind of planning and evaluating the need for transmission, there's also the whole permitting process to evaluate the route that a new transmission facility is going to go through. And there's lots of different entities that are involved in that process. There's also transmission developers that are sometimes play a role here where it's not utilities build and own a lot of transmission. There are also competitive transmission developers that in certain cases play a role in getting transmission built. And then sometimes developers of generating facilities, so wind or solar farms, for example, that are looking to connect to the grid, sometimes also are involved in paying for transmission as part of the process of connecting projects to the grid. It's often not the most efficient way to plan and pay for and build our transmission system, but they can also play a role in sort of the build out of the grid. And then in terms of how transmission gets built, there's a bunch of different layers of planning that happen that identify the need for transmission. So there's sort of local and near-term planning. That's currently where a lot of our transmission infrastructure gets planned and built, is in local planning and in sort of near-term, next 3-year identification of transmission needs. And there are a couple of reasons for that that we can get into. And then there's also regional planning, and this is currently, there's a requirement for regional entities to do regional planning of transmission, but that's also what the recent FERC order looks to expand and improve, is the regional transmission planning process, to make sure that that's actually a forward-looking process that evaluates a range of factors and benefits to identify the most efficient transmission to serve regional grid needs. So that process has not yet become reality, that there's a requirement for regional grid entities to come into compliance and to start doing more robust regional planning. And then I think the last part of your question was around who pays. So this is really a big challenge with transmission. In general, electricity ratepayers ultimately pay for transmission because it as part of your electric bill, but how that bill gets split is a very contentious question. At the highest level, there's a general principle that applies, that is beneficiary pays. So if you benefit from transmission, you share in the cost of the transmission. If you don't benefit from the transmission, you don't share in the cost. But how do you calculate what those benefits are, and how do you determine who actually benefits? And then there's different ways that you can think about actually splitting up that cost based on the benefits. And that is often where there are disputes or disagreements, and where some transmission projects that bring overall net benefits end up getting caught up in sort of disagreement about relative benefit and who should pay and how much.
That is very complicated. It gets complicated very quickly, I think. I think you explained it very well, but this is, we do want to do a lot more webinars like this, trying to make complicated topics like this a little bit more accessible. Thank you. I am going to ask a couple more questions, and then I am going to get to the questions in the chat because there are some really good ones there. First of all, does it take a long time to build new transmission? Like, what are some of the challenges around building these new projects?
Yeah, so it can take decades to get transmission built. There are several challenges. One is that we're not currently, and there are some exceptions to this, but we're not doing good planning for transmission. And this, again, this is what the FERC order seeks to address. But to define that a little bit more, a lot of our planning is sort of looking at near-term needs for transmission. It's siloed, so it's looking at what are reliability needs versus what are economic needs, rather than bundling up what are all of the drivers of the need for transmission, all the things that we talked about at the beginning of this call, sort of bundling that into one planning process. It doesn't look long term. So we're failing to get a lot of the efficiencies and the benefits that you would get from a more regional, longer term process. So that's exactly what the FERC order requires. It almost seems when I describe this to friends and family, like, how come this is not how we're already doing it? But it requires looking out 20 years. These are multi-decade infrastructure projects. It takes decades in some cases to build transmission. We're talking about transmission as being needed to meet these long-term trends. So it makes sense that we should be looking out on a 20-year horizon when thinking about doing good transmission planning. FERC is also going to require looking at all of the drivers of transmission, potential transmission need, and at a range of benefits, all in the same planning process, so that you are taking a more holistic, comprehensive view and ultimately identifying the most efficient overall for future projects to meet system needs. There's also the disagreements around around cost and who should pay that I sort of just touched on. And again, this is something that FERC addresses in its transmission planning rule, where it's requiring that there be a default on the books, basically, so that you don't all get the check when you've identified all these beneficial transmission projects and nobody can agree on how to pay it. And the result of that is really bad for everyone, because it means that we underinvest and ultimately end up with a system that's not built for purpose, that's not maximizing on benefits and minimizing on cost to deliver the grid that we need. So it's sort of short-sighted to not have an agreement in place to make sure that, consistent with beneficiary pays, to ensure that you actually have a plan for how this infrastructure is going to get paid for. There's also long permitting processes. This is something that the U.S. Department of Energy is working to streamline. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and DOE do have sort of backstop siting authority also to help to address some of the siting and permitting challenges that can emerge with transmission. And then there can also just be local resistance to new infrastructure. I think this is not unique to transmission in any way. I think there's increased awareness of the need for robust and early community engagement to develop to address concerns with new infrastructure. And then I think there's also a sort of a lack of support and understanding of the role of transmission. Unlike clean energy, I think there's a lot that's exciting about transmission infrastructure. It really is kind of the key to unlock all of this transition. But it's not something that gets people excited to show up and support at a local town meeting. So sort of the local resistance, and then I think maybe lack of activation and motivation around transmission is another challenge. So lots of challenges to getting transmission built, but also I think some good progress out of FERC and some other federal agencies to tackle some of those big challenges.
Awesome. Well, I hope that we are starting to build an army of people who are excited to get out to their town meetings about transmission and building transmission in their area. Because yeah, the energy can't get to you if there's no transmission. So cool. And then I will ask one last question that I have, and then I'll go to the chat or the questions. Do utilities usually prefer to build new transmission lines or upgrade existing lines?
Yeah, this is an interesting issue. I think, and we've talked about how our existing infrastructure is in many cases, it warrants some upgrades. In a lot of ways, there's less friction to upgrading existing lines. Siting and permitting is less complicated if you're dealing with existing right-of-ways. There's also some, in some cases, incentives for the utility to prefer upgrades to existing lines, where the utility has the right to develop that project and earn a return on it without having to participate in a competitive process. So that can be another factor. Which does not mean that, sometimes upgrading an existing line is the right solution, but that should be evaluated as part of kind of a broader look at, do we need to upgrade this line? Do we maybe need to upgrade it and what's called right size it, which is basically kind of expand it to meet future needs, or is it actually more efficient to do something else? Is there a different solution? And so looking at those questions kind of transparently and holistically as part of a broader planning process is ultimately the most efficient way to get there. And we're going to need all of these things. We're going to need grid enhancing technologies. We're going to need replacement of existing lines. We're going to need upgrades to existing lines and expansion. We're going to need new lines built as well. But hopefully we're evaluating all of those things together, and with an eye toward the future that we're actually headed toward.
Awesome. Cool. I've thought of a few more questions, but I'm going to go to the chat first because I think I'm being selfish. Our first couple of questions, they go together. So I'm going to ask you both of them at once. How do you get local energy companies to place current transmission lines underground as well as to keep them waterproof? And what is going to happen to our above ground transmission facilities as weather gets more and more extreme? Are there any alternatives to traditional towers and wires above ground?
Yeah, great questions. And I think these end up varying sort of regionally, and it depends. Like undergrounding lines is quite expensive. So whether that is necessary in a given location is going to depend on the kinds of weather and the kinds of risks that you're seeing. And that's in some cases something that utilities are looking at under or proposing as part of whether it's a grid modernization plan or that state utility commissioners would look at and review and have to make a determination of whether that's going to be ultimately cost beneficial for customers. And I think it comes down to sort of what is the level of risk in a given area and what's the cost going to be for that kind of undergrounding. There's also sort of obviously the concerns with fire and making sure that transmission infrastructure is robustly protected from becoming a risk there. And again, what the solutions are and evaluating the costs and benefits is going to be kind of locally, regionally dependent.
Awesome. That is, yeah, I think about that too when I see like any power line and I'm like, oh, there's a huge storm coming. That's always something that I, worry about. We got a question that is, what part will better batteries play in storage and transmission?
Yeah, so one thing that we would have liked to have seen in this recent FERC order was a requirement as part of the requirement for consideration of alternative transmission technologies. We would have liked to have seen battery storage be included in that list, but storage can play a role in serving as a transmission asset to address congestion and help during to support the system during times of peak load or grid stress. So I think that is something that some regions are working on and something that we'll just have to continue pushing for evaluation of battery storage in the planning process. It's actually something that United has requested what was called requesting rehearing at FERC. When an order comes out, parties can go back to the commission and say, here's something that we think you should have done differently, and can argue for that, for things to be changed in the final order. So that is one issue that we have asked FERC to improve and to make that a requirement. But in any case, there's no reason that a region couldn't take it upon themselves to consider storage as a transmission asset. And I think as we are, like I said, all of these solutions are going to be needed. And I think storage will certainly play a role.
Awesome. And United and Counterspark are very, very extremely aligned. But if you want to learn more about Advanced Energy United and stuff that they do specifically, you can, we'll put their website in the chat as well. We do a lot of, lawmaker activation at Counterspark, but Advanced Energy United has regulatory experts and all that kind of stuff. One question that I want to ask that's actually not in the chat really quickly is you keep talking about these regional organizations, and can you tell us more about them? What are they? I actually talked to a couple of friends before this webinar and asked them, who are not energy experts, and they asked me questions about Texas, because Texas is often in the news for like blackouts and stuff like that. So is there a way you could tell us more about these regional organizations and how, where they are, what they do, and if there are any states that are unique?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And I will try to not bore you too much in my answer. So there are Texas, people might have heard about ERCOT, the Energy Regulatory Commission of Texas. During the winter storm Uri, suddenly a regional grid operator one state grid operator was suddenly in the news. So that is the Texas grid operator. Texas is the only state that has its own grid that is not meaningfully interconnected to the rest of the United States. So they are not subject to FERC jurisdiction, since FERC regulates interstate electricity, and Texas generally has one state grid. So they're a little bit unique. The other grid operators in New England, there is the Independent System Operator of New England. In the Mid-Atlantic, there's PJM Interconnection. In the Midwest, there's the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, or MISO. In the sort of southern middle part of the country, there's the Southwest Power Pool. And then there are two other single state grid operators in California, the California Independent System Operator, or CAISO, and then the New York Independent System Operator, or NYISO. Those are subject to FERC jurisdiction because those states are interconnected with other neighboring states. And what those grid operators do, they do a few different things. Transmission planning is one of them. They also operate wholesale electricity markets. So the purchase and sale of electricity at wholesale to then get distributed to homes and businesses. And they also operate the bulk power system, so making sure that the lights stay on a day-to-day basis. So they play a really important role. They are regulated by FERC, and again, their role here is, and they're independent entities, so they are independent of the utilities in those regions and the power generators in those regions, and their role is really to maintain a competitive grid and make sure that the lights stay on in those regions. So from a transmission planning perspective, they sort of run the regional transmission planning, and they will be complying with this FERC order. The two regions that don't have a regional and independent regional grid operator are the Southeast and the West, sort of outside of California. And those regions will still have to comply with this FERC order. They will just be doing it sort of without the benefit of an independent grid operator that plays that role. There are sort of regional planning entities in those regions, but they're a little bit less robust and transparent and independent in terms of the way that the stakeholder process in those regions works. So as a result, there's less regional coordination on transmission planning.
Awesome. Thank you, Caitlin. And I wanted to ask that before there are a couple of other questions in the chat that to me go together. And one of them is, how can we be sure that this will truly be for the people and not for profit at the expense of the people? So I suspect, what can we do? Is there a way that we can work on that? Or, if not, what are your thoughts? And then I think kind of, well, I'll wait to ask that one. So I'll just ask that one first.
Yeah. So I think the rule from FERC is definitely set up in a way to make sure that there's really robust evaluation of the need for transmission and also of the evaluation of the benefits. And I think that will all play out within the stakeholder processes at these regional transmission operators that I was just talking about. I think the ways that people can get most involved, if you don't want to sit through 8-hour stakeholder meetings on a weekly basis to listen to the details of the transmission planning process, is to encourage your state consumer advocate, your state utility regulator to be a part of that process, because states have a critical role in both evaluating, providing input into the process, agreeing on weighing in and potentially developing alternative cost allocation. So encouraging state involvement in the process, both sort of directly from the state agencies and also I think from the highest level, making sure that states are engaged with their RTOs on making sure that there is a robust regional planning process that's transparent, that is fair, and that takes all of the risks and benefits into account, I think is how we make sure that the outcomes of this process are actually to the benefit of the people that the grid is supposed to serve.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, and we are always pushing out actions at Counterspark. So I think we did one actually right after the FERC rule. So if folks want to find that is on our site under the campaigns page. That is still live.
Yeah, and
go ahead.
No, I was just going to say there's a compliance plans are due in a year. So there's, and after that is when the planning process will start. So there is plenty of time to still weigh in. We have a final order from FERC, but there's plenty of time to weigh in to shape how it actually is implemented.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you so much, Caitlin. And similarly, we got a similar question about siting. What are some primary policy actions and focuses to help address transmission siting conflicts? And they also asked about impacts on environmental habitats and species, and what are reasonable ways to mitigate those impacts, but still build the transmission that we need.
Yeah, I will preface this with saying I am not a siting expert, but I will say I think that on this issue and on a lot of other infrastructure issues, and including development of individual generating projects, what we have seen is really early community involvement and engagement is a critical tool to identify potential concerns and actually work through them and potentially be able to make some tweaks and changes based on concerns that are coming up. Sort of front loading that community engagement is really critical. And then I did mention that federal agencies are working on ways to streamline permitting in ways that don't short circuit the important environmental reviews, but just streamline kind of the federal coordination of some of those reviews. So that is one ongoing effort at the U.S. Department of Energy. And then there's also, both if there's certainly interest in at a congressional level in improvements to permitting, but then also I think it just gets down to being a very locally specific issue in terms of where it needs to get resolved, who is responsible, varies by state and location, and sort of where those debates and discussions happen.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you, Caitlin. Yeah, and we've been pushing a lot of stuff out about siting from the Counterspark side. I won't have our team put the website in the chat yet, but if you're on the Counterspark list, we've been talking a lot about siting. There are a lot of groups that are, I would say fear mongering a little bit when it comes to siting, when it comes to building projects. But most of the fights that I've seen, they are taking into account like the environmental concerns in addition to the need to build energy. Yeah. Cool. All right. Reading a question here real quickly. Sorry about that. All right. Caitlin, when we asked folks to take action after the FERC rule came out, we did not have a specific action for New York, but we have a few New Yorkers who are in the chat who would like to know what they can do if there's anything specific. If you want to work with me after this to come up with something, I'm happy to take that on as well.
Yeah, and I think the reason that New York was not as much of a target, New York and I would say also California have been a little bit more forward-looking in transmission planning and in coordinating their transmission planning with sort of forward-looking energy policy goals and needs in the state. I think partly this is a little bit easier for single state grid regions to do because you are only aligning one state's policy goals, and so it just takes less coordination, and there's instant alignment with your state if it's one state versus a multi-state region where there are different policies and maybe disagreement about the relative importance of different drivers and considerations. But I think it's still, New York, NYISO will, with the grid operator in New York, will still have to comply with the FERC order. And I'm sure that there are, we have not done a full sort of side-by-side comparison yet of NYISO and the FERC order, but there will undoubtedly be opportunities for improvement to NYISO's existing transmission planning that we'll be evaluating. And I think Amanda and I will stay in touch as that unfolds and look for things to uplift for New York to improve upon.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Caitlin. And thank you to all of the New Yorkers who are asking us questions. I've seen a couple, one person from Arizona. You're not required to tell us where you are based, but just the folks who have opted to share. So yeah, thank you. And thank you for looking for that action. Awesome. So we only have about 10 minutes left. So Caitlin, I kind of want to ask you just like hopefully a positive question to like close us out. And there are a few questions in the chat we didn't get to, so we will try to follow up with you all afterwards. But Caitlin, what are you optimistic about? What are you pessimistic about when it comes to transmission in the country?
I'll start with what I'm pessimistic about because then we'll end on a high note. I think it's a complicated issue that just involves a lot. I ran through, all of the entities that are involved in transmission planning. There's a lot of places that a transmission project can die along the process of getting built, and so the amount of investment that's needed, how urgently it's needed, how long it has historically taken, this is, and the number of entities that need to align to get there is daunting. On the other hand, I think I'm optimistic because there is really a recognition that we are past due for progress on transmission planning. We have this FERC order now that is requiring every region of the country to do better long-term transmission planning. So I think this is a front and center issue. You know, electricity prices and reliability are increasingly issues that are front and center, and transmission is central to those issues. So I think there's a lot of attention, a lot of energy, a lot of energy devoted to this, brain power devoted to this across the country. And so I think there's a lot of motivation and a lot of people devoted to thinking about and solving these issues. So that definitely gives me hope. And there's also examples across the country. You know, I mentioned MISO as one of the grid operators. They have, in a multi-state region, managed to align on multiple long-term transmission projects and get those across the line and work to get them built. So we know that this can be done, and you know, we got our work cut out for us, but we can do it.
That's so exciting. And honestly, I feel like when you turn on the news, almost everything is political. But when I think of MISO, it's not just red states and it's not just blue states in that region. They have some of the reddest and some of the bluest. And so that is very, very positive. So thank you. Thank you so much. And is there anything else that you want to add before I give folks the next say goodbye?
Yeah. No, I appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation and to pull my head out of the 1,300 pages of this FERC order, and actually remind myself also of why I do this work. And I think, you know, and with one other thing that gives me optimism is people like everyone on this call joining the Counterspark website actually taking interest in transmission as an issue. I think that really bodes well to our collective ability to elevate the importance of transmission and actually, you know, push our politicians, push our regulators to take this seriously and to roll up their sleeves and make progress on it. So,
well, thank you.
Yeah.
And if you asked a question in the chat and we didn't get to it, we'll follow up with you afterwards. But we really appreciate you all joining us today. We will let you know through, if you have any questions, feel free to contact me directly. We'll let you know about the next webinar. We'll send you a recording of this one within the next few days. And we'll let you know when there are siting fights or grid enhancing technologies fights or anything like that in your state. So thank you all so much for joining us today. And we will see you next time. But thank you. Bye.